in space.
Welcome to Today in Space. I am your science communicator, Alex Orfanos, and we are back for another episode of Today in Space. I was out the last few days with my voice, we're I would say 85%. I'm getting there. I'm getting a little bit better, but well enough to do the podcast and get caught up on the Starship, the SpaceX update that just happened. So let's dive into this. And what I wanted to do this week was kind of pick some major topics that I think are really important, that are new, that we learned in the update, and that are new to the way the industry is doing things. What we've seen from this update is a fully assembled Starship Mark 1, which will be the Starship that will do a lot of the tests. It's not going to be an orbital Starship. It's definitely not going to send humans, but it's going to be doing much higher altitude jumps than the Starhopper did. So the Starhopper got some initial tests done, really just test that the Raptor engine works and that we can go to certain heights and maneuver a weight. But what Starship is going to be doing is potentially 1,000 trips reusable. This is the goal that they're shooting for, that each Starship will be able to launch and do 1,000 missions. That is a very a very audacious goal. We have yet to even have humans on board, but this is very early in the process. Remember, they just launched the Starhopper. This is not anywhere close to the final product, and Starship won't be completed for a while. But there are a lot of things we can get excited about and put SpaceX on the record, which they've already done, and talk about what could happen, so we can start talking about the challenges that they're going to have about making this happen in reality. I think a big focus of this show is what can be done today in space, right? That's why the show is named that for a specific reason. There are plenty of things, and I got into this conversation earlier this week with Sarah, which she brought up a good point. This show is really focused about what's happening today, what's possible in space today, not so much what's possible in the future, or even theoretical space science, like black holes. All of that stuff is really cool, but as an aerospace engineer, that's kind of what I focus on. I focus on, can we do that now? And that kind of lays the base for what we can do later. And Starship is a perfect example of that. And so one of the things that we did all week was 3D print and a wooden model version. That's right, we 3D printed in wood a material called wood PLA, which is like PLA plastic, the same thing this is made out of, but it has wood particles in it. So we 3D printed it, we worked it, we bonded all the pieces together, and we made a final model, and it actually stained really well. So I'm going to bring it out. We're going to show that off because it's about time. And here we have the 3D printed and stained Starship. This is an older model. The model that we saw in the presentation, the Mark 1, didn't have this third leg. This makes it a great model to show off and to explain, but it's also important to know that there have been some changes. And what you're seeing here is a giant, almost it'll be a clear, incredible viewing space while you're on that. And then all of these different areas are going to represent, from what I understand, crew cabins. So up to 100 people are supposed to be able to travel on a Starship from planet to planet, location to location. And one of the major things that Starship is going to be able to do that is not possible today and hasn't been done, but SpaceX just received $3 million as a contract from NASA to develop this technology, and that is to refuel in orbit. Now, why is that important, and why hasn't that been done today? Refueling in orbit is something that can completely change the way that you look at a mission, the way that you design a mission, the way that you go about planning all of the different things. And one of the things that you plan is something called delta V. And so when we're talking about rocket science, delta V is a really important concept. It's the variable that most missions are designed around. And so I'm trying to figure out a way to explain a complex topic like delta V in the simplest of way, but no simpler, because that is our science communication initiative here at Today in Space. So the example I thought of, I think works. And if there's any rocket scientists, aerospace engineers out there, check me on this. Let me know how I did. But Delta V is kind of like, if you're thinking about, the best thing you could think about is another vehicle, right? Because the Delta V is not so much, if you remember your science and your algebra and some of your calculus, the delta sign, that's the change in, so the change in velocity. It's not like a variable of like what this vehicle is possible. Like I can change maximum like 100 meters per second really quick, like at an instant. It's like no. That's not what the Delta V is. The Delta V is more like how much fuel you have for your mission, combined with how much you can actually make use of it with those rockets on board and thrusters and being able to change that. So it's how you can change your velocity and how much changes you can do to your velocity. That's your tank. That's kind of like your fuel tank of change in velocity. So the reason refueling in orbit is so important is because for most missions, once you get up into orbit, you launch on the first stage, all right, the first stage goes away, but eventually the spacecraft is going to have to make some moves in orbit and get it to a certain point. So your Delta V is dependent on how much you have left over after you go into orbit. What Starship is able to do and what Starship is going to change is once you're in orbit, you can fully fill the fuel tank back up for the Starship, making it possible to do way more with a mission than you've ever been able to before. And so why is that important? Well, think about Delta V in this way. If we had fusion, people talk about the future of space and the possibilities that are out there. Why fusion is such a giant step forward and a game changer for space travel is, if you had unlimited energy, you have an unlimited fuel tank, that means your Delta V is infinite. That means that you can literally go to any planet, make changes. Your spacecraft now becomes something out of science fiction, that it's the one spacecraft that travels you everywhere and you never have to worry about how much fuel you have, which means you can go planet to planet to planet, back to wherever you want. Almost brings us into a Star Trek-esque era if we have fusion, where then is really just about making sure that the engine is working and everything, but you can do these long duration missions and have humans on board these giant spaceships for a long period of time. But until we get fusion, we need to figure out how to be more efficient with our fuels and our rocket systems. So this is why the Starship is so valuable if it's able to do what it's able to do. By refueling the Starship in orbit around Earth, it allows the Starship to go to the moon and land and then launch back without even having to refuel. And that makes it extremely important. And it changes, again, like I said, the whole aspect of how we look at missions. So Starship is incredible in that way, that if it's successful, we'll actually be able to see some amazing things come out of that. But there's a lot that needs to happen. They need to develop the technology to dock a spacecraft, and then they have to create the tanker of the Starship after that will then need to develop the technology to connect with each other to fuel in orbit. So there's a lot that needs to be done. But they have been doing docking with the International Space Station, which, as Elon Musk mentioned, and it does make sense if that the International Space Station is actually harder to dock with than what they could potentially be doing with the Starship. So the Starship, they'd have a little bit more control. You don't have to go as high into orbit, which means you don't have to go as fast. One of the things that Elon Musk brought up that's a very important concept about orbital mechanics here is that, get a prop here, this is a moon model, just but just as a perspective. So if you're orbiting, what allows you to go at different heights in orbit is actually your velocity. So you're actually, if you're orbiting something, if you go faster, you start rising above in orbit. And if you decrease your velocity, you drop in orbit. So one of the things about the International Space Station is it's so high up that you have to be able to do a very high velocity, and then you have to match it so that you can get slow enough that the speed between the two of the International Space Station and whatever's docking, in this case the Dragon capsule, can do it safely. And if you don't have to go as high into orbit or to go as fast, you then don't have to work as hard to get the docking procedure to work. So you can actually fuel lower in orbit than you would be able to, let's say, in the International Space Station. So they're already working on something harder, which should lend them some good lessons for doing something that is fundamentally easier. But again, no one has ever done this before. So there's a lot to learn, a lot to be done. One of the other thing that's very valuable about Starship, and it is also a stark change from where spacecraft, how they're being developed. Weight is the big thing, right? Another concept in that delta V equation, that tank of moves that you can make throughout orbit. The heavier your spacecraft is, the more mass it's going to have, which means each move is more costly, right? So if your spacecraft is really heavy, even if you have a really big fuel source, it's still going to be costly each move to change velocity. But Starship is made out of stainless steel, and it's made out of cold rolled sheets that are then friction stir welded together to create almost the perfect seal weld that you could get. It's a very strong one too. If you've never seen the videos of that, it's pretty amazing. I'll try and put a link to that, a YouTube clip of what that looks like, and it's pretty wild. But by using stainless steel, they're able to cut the entire weight of the spacecraft because the material that is constructing Starship is stronger, which means the thickness of every single piece and the structures they can make can be thinner and thinner. So even though mass wise stainless steel is heavier than carbon fiber, the structures that you can create in stainless steel are much thinner, which means you can get a thinner spacecraft. But again, nobody is doing these techniques right now. So everything that SpaceX does is at a cost, and they need to do X amount of missions to get the cost down to the point where they want to get it. What we're seeing is just sheer fundamental physics, the fundamentals of, if you can make a structure that's stronger and thinner at a cheaper cost, that's the way to go, and that's what SpaceX is trying to do, and they're putting the investments in to do this. One other major concept that we heard discussed in the SpaceX Starship update was when Elon Musk was talking about the difference in how, say, the Falcon 9 lands, and really like the space shuttle, right? The space shuttle would use the belly of the shuttle with the tiles to glide in and take the heat of reentry and then come in for a landing. But Starship is different in that when it's coming into orbit, coming here, coming down to land, we've got definitely an aspect ratio issue going on here. Like, this is not to scale, people, but we're going to have Starship coming in, and Elon Musk said it's more like a skydiver, going belly first, and then until the very last moment, almost like pulling with a parachute, is going to kick up and then come down to land. So a very different concept of just how to properly land something like this. Instead of coming in for like a landing like on legs, literally just until the last minute, pulling up and then landing with thrust, which is just wild. And so on the more updated version of Starship, we saw with the Mark 1, these up here, these flaps are going to be fully movable, so they're going to be able to move and adjust and aero brake so that the spacecraft can actually come down to a low enough speed to land at the very end. So even more of a dramatic move than even the first stages are making when they're doing their landings, like the Falcon 9s. So it's a wild approach. Again, something completely new that's never been tested. But the thing that cannot be underestimated is that the engineers that are working for SpaceX are all engineers who think in this similar manner. Now, I know a few that worked there or have worked there, and it definitely comes from that similar mindset that they want to make a difference in the space industry. They want to be a part of something that is happening now that they're able to make happen. And not only that, do amazing things like landing on the moon. There's so many aerospace engineers and engineers out there that want to do amazing things like landing on the moon, that want to be a part of something like that. And SpaceX offers that opportunity. And what we're seeing with SpaceX is years of engineers, of building a culture at SpaceX, of learning how to move quickly and develop. Remember, 11 years from the original first launch of SpaceX, of the Falcon 1, to when they have the Starship. And that is a good enough time to develop a culture and to learn enough times how to develop technology quickly. And in Tim Dodd's interview at Everyday Astronaut with Elon Musk after that presentation, was that Elon Musk, the thing I really took away from it was he was talking about how SpaceX has really learned how to move fast. And they come from a thought process of, if, there are so many engineers out there, and I can say I totally agree with this because I am an engineer and I do work in engineering, that there are times when engineers can get stuck in the way we think the design should be, and then we try and focus way too much on how to make something that's really not the best way to do it work. So then you spend all this time optimizing something that in the end doesn't give you what you really need. And so what they're really focused on is, when they're starting to develop something, if it becomes too complex, then there was something originally wrong with the way that they first designed it. Engineering is really about simplicity, right? So it's really about trying to get the simplest design that does the best thing. And what I'm hearing from SpaceX and from their CEO, the owner, the person who started this thing, is that if it's too complex, start over with a better design. That is huge. That is not something we see. We see, I would say, from my perspective, we see a holding on to what the old design was and what the old approach was. And not that there's anything wrong with that, but if it does slow you down and it becomes too complex, you do have to drop it and move on. This approach, while some people may see it as hasty and not safe enough, if they're able to do all the tests and they're able to develop quickly and change when things are wrong, is that a bad thing? I do not think so. I think it's actually the way to go. And then we can have the discussion of, okay, we need this to be even safer. What can we do? Then they will be able to figure that out, and they'll be able to figure it out quickly. So I love the approach. It's something I love hearing coming out of Elon Musk, and I'm very excited to see what they do with the Starship. So this update has been really amazing. There's so much to talk about. That's what we're trying to do here. Share complex scientific content in the simplest of ways, but no simpler. So we hope you've learned a little bit about what it means to actually travel through space, the value of Starship, and if you want to actually see how we created this 3D printed prop, how we 3D printed it and how we bonded it, stained it, and made this thing, we have a full video. It's about 3 minutes long on our YouTube channel at AG3D Printing. You can check that out there. This was a super fun project. We're going to do more of this. And if you want to help support the podcast, because profits from AG3D do go to funding this podcast and getting us more machines so we can make more things, you can check us out at ag3d-printing.com. Look, if you have anything you want to get 3D printed, if you have an idea, even if you have something that's on the back of a piece of paper, it's an idea. You're J.K. Rowling in the coffee shop writing on a napkin. We can help you out, help you bring that idea into reality with iterative prototyping. We have design services here. We can help you design stuff. If you have a model, we can just help you 3D print stuff. Halloween is coming up. We got plenty of stuff we can make. I know I'm working on my Halloween costume. Hopefully I will have that done before Halloween, so I'll be able to show that off on this podcast. I worked on it last year, didn't quite get there, and I got the shape right, but now I got to get all the mounting for all the electronics because it does light up. So hopefully we'll do that. We'll share that with AG3D Printing. And that's about it, folks. I'm going to keep getting myself better. If you got a cold, please do take the time. Look, I'm definitely the kind of person that will work myself into the ground, and it was the right decision, to take a few days off and rest a little bit so that I can come back and keep the show going. So I wish the same for you. If you are that kind of person that you push yourself a little too hard, it's good to take that time to rest and do yourself right. So have a great week. We'll be back next time on the podcast for another episode. If you have any ideas that you'd like us to cover on the podcast, please hit us up. We're more than welcome to do that. I know there's been a request to talk about all the different space agencies that are out there. I know we had that as a comment a few weeks before. I'm going to be working on that. We'll put that together. Anything else you guys would like for us to cover, please hit us up. Have a great week. Spread love, spread science. See you next time.